You didn't become distant. You stopped reaching for what kept missing you. And that difference matters more than you were taught to believe. At first, it felt uncomfortable because distance was never your nature. You were the one who stayed curious, who asked questions, who tried again, who bridged emotional gaps without being asked. So when you stopped doing that, it didn't feel like growth. It felt like loss, not of them, of the version of you who kept offering access, even when it wasn't being respected. You were told that love requires openness. That connection means availability. That pulling back means you're closing your heart. But no one taught you the difference between openness and overexposure. Selectivity isn't cold, it's conscious. And consciousness changes how much access you're willing to give. What shifted wasn't your capacity to feel, it was your tolerance for emotional inconsistency. Your nervous system stopped negotiating. You noticed how certain interactions left you tight instead of settled, how certain people required effort just to feel normal around, how your body prepared itself before conversations that were supposed to feel safe. That preparation wasn't intuition being dramatic. It was your system recognizing a pattern. For a long time, you ignored that signal. You told yourself you were overthinking. You rationalized the discomfort. You stayed engaged because leaving felt harsh, but staying was costing you something. Every time you adjusted your tone to be received, every time you softened your truth to keep the peace, every time you stayed present while feeling unseen, your system learned that connection required self-reduction, and eventually, it stopped cooperating. That's when people noticed a change, not because you announced it, but because you stopped compensating. You replied slower. You explained less. You no longer chased resolution. And suddenly, you were labeled distant. But distance implies disinterest. What you felt was discernment. You weren't pulling away to be noticed. You were pulling inward to stay regulated. This is the part that rarely gets named. When you're emotionally intelligent, people unconsciously rely on you to carry relational weight. You become the translator, the emotional anchor, the one who stabilizes the dynamic. And when you stop doing that, the imbalance becomes visible, not because you changed, but because you stopped masking what was already there. Selectivity emerges when your nervous system realizes it no longer has to earn safety. You began choosing interactions that didn't require recovery time, conversations where your body stayed soft, connections that didn't ask you to prove your worth through endurance. This wasn't avoidance, it was recalibration. Your system learned that peace isn't passive, it's protective. And once you experience what regulated connection feels like, your body stops responding to anything else. This is why you don't feel drawn to emotional intensity anymore, why urgency feels foreign, why drama feels loud. Your system isn't bored, it's healed enough to recognize safety. Being selective means you now ask a different question. Not, can I handle this? But, does this handle me? And that shift changes everything. You started noticing how often you were asked to explain yourself after you had already been clear, not because your words were confusing, but because clarity made other people uncomfortable. When you stopped offering emotional availability on demand, some connections lost their shape, not because you withdrew, but because they were built on access, not mutual presence. You weren't pulling away from intimacy. You were stepping out of emotional labor. For a long time, you were the one translating feelings into language, naming what was happening, smoothing tension, creating safety. where there wasn't much to begin with. That role felt like love, until it felt like fatigue. You noticed how often connection depended on you staying soft, while the other person stayed vague. How you were expected to remain open, even when they remained undefined. That imbalance wasn't accidental. It was structural. Emotionally unavailable dynamics survive because someone else is doing the regulating. When you stop being that person, the dynamic didn't deepen. It destabilized, and that destabilization was blamed on you. You became harder to reach, less open, different. But what really changed was your willingness to keep absorbing uncertainty. You no longer filled in the blanks. When someone left you guessing, you no longer chased clarity from people who benefited from ambiguity. And that choice didn't come from anger. It came from your body recognizing that constant emotional scanning was not intimacy. It was vigilance. You realized how often you stayed present while internally bracing, how often you anticipated reactions, softened needs, prepared explanations. That preparation disappeared, not because you stopped caring, but because your system learned it wasn't required. Selectivity isn't about exclusion, it's about alignment. You began allowing access only where your nervous system didn't need armor, only where conversation felt reciprocal, only where presence didn't require performance. And yes, that made some people uneasy because they were used to your overavailability, your patience, your emotional translation. When that ended, they felt the absence. But absence doesn't mean loss. It means boundary. You weren't testing anyone. You weren't waiting to be chased. You were simply no longer willing to organize your emotional world around someone else's avoidance. This is why you don't rush to explain anymore. Not because you're guarded, but because explanation used to be a substitute for mutual effort. You now understand that people who want to understand pay attention. They don't need repeated clarification. They don't need urgency to show up. So you stop justifying your limits. You let your choices speak. And that quiet shift felt unsettling at first because you were taught that love looks like availability. But what you're learning now is that safety looks like selectivity. And selectivity doesn't close your heart, it protects it. You didn't wake up one day and decide to change. Your body did it first, before your mind caught up, before you had language for it. You felt it in the way your energy stayed with you, instead of reaching outward, in how conversations ended, without you replaying them later, in how silence stopped feeling like something you needed to fix. That's not distance, that's regulation. For a long time, your nervous system was trained to stay alert in connection, to scan for tone, for timing, for shifts you needed to manage. That alertness felt responsible. It felt loving. But responsibility isn't intimacy. It's adaptation. And adaptation has a cost. When you stopped adapting, people felt it immediately because they were used to your emotional availability, being unconditional, used to you being accessible, even when they weren't consistent. So when you became selective, it felt abrupt to them. But to you, it felt like relief. Relief is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself. It settles. You began noticing how little effort was required in certain connections, how ease showed up when you didn't have to lead emotionally, how calm followed interactions that didn't demand explanation, and how heavy it felt to return to dynamics that relied on you staying open while the other stayed distant. Your attraction shifted, not because you stopped caring, but because your body stopped rewarding imbalance. You weren't numbing yourself. You were listening, listening to tension, to relief, to the quiet information you used to override. Selectivity emerged when your system realized it no longer had to earn closeness. That closeness could be mutual, reciprocal, safe. You started choosing where your softness landed. Not everywhere, not automatically, but intentionally. That choice wasn't defensive. It was discerning. And discernment feels quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It doesn't explain. It notices. You noticed who met you without effort, who didn't need reminders, who showed up without needing access to all of you. And you also noticed who only felt connected when you were overfunctioning. That contrast clarified things faster than words ever could. You didn't grow colder. You grew clearer. You stopped mistaking availability for intimacy. You stopped equating consistency with boredom. Your nervous system recalibrated to a different standard, one that doesn't require you to disappear, to stay connected. That's why this feels different. Not dramatic, not urgent, just true. You didn't become selective to be admired. You became selective because your body learned what safety feels like. And once safety is registered, your system won't negotiate it away. That's the part people don't warn you about. Growth doesn't look impressive. It looks quiet. It looks like walking away without needing the other person to agree with your reasons. It looks like not reaching back just to soothe someone else's discomfort. You no longer chase connection. That costs you regulation. You no longer offer access to people who haven't shown they can hold it. That isn't distance. That's discernment in action. And discernment doesn't shout. It decides. You may notice fewer conversations now, fewer explanations, fewer emotional entanglements. But what replaces them is something deeper: stability, presence, a sense of self that doesn't dissolve when someone else is inconsistent. This is emotional maturity, integrating into your choices, not as a concept, as a lived boundary. And here's what matters most. If this resonates, it's not because you're becoming detached. It's because your nervous system has outgrown survival-based connection. You are no longer organizing your life around being understood. You're organizing it around being at peace. That shift will change who has access to you, who stays, who fades. Let it. This isn't loss. It's alignment. If this video named something you've been feeling but hadn't fully trusted yet, stay here. Listen more. Pay attention to what your body relaxes into. And if you want to keep exploring this quieter form of strength, this channel is for you. Not to motivate you, but to help you recognize what you already know. You didn't become distant. You became selective. And that choice is worth protecting.